Hey, what's up everybody? It's LeeLos, and today we're talking about why Hisoka versus the Shadow Beast is complex. Stay steady in pursuit of your dreams and goals. You're born to win, you're made for greatness, and I definitely believe in you guys. Keep up the great work each and every day. So Hisoka versus the Shadow Beast is a battle between one of the more powerful characters in the series versus 10 powerful Nen users. Today we're going to analyze every single power-up and ability these characters have displayed to figure out overall who's more likely to win between these characters. So first off, let's talk about the Shadow Beasts. Are they actually frauds? The manga depiction of the Shadow Beasts is different than the anime, with the manga portraying them as a bit more powerful, and many of the feats that they perform in the series are pretty underrated. The Hunter x Hunter Dons selected the strongest Nen user from 10 different regions, put them together, and created the Shadow Beasts. You could argue they might not actually be the strongest Nen user from their region. They could just be the strongest Nen user that they had access to, but this introduction alone narratively makes them pretty impressive. 4 of the 10 Shadow Beasts fight against Uvogin, and the feats they perform against him are pretty underrated. It's implied they actually could have defeated Uvogin if they weren't clowning around during the battle. Rabbit Dog bites through Uvogin's skin and stun locks him with paralyzing poison. Machi states if he had used a lethal poison, then they would have actually just defeated Uvogin right there. This is really impressive because at this point in the fight, none of the Shadow Beasts had actually died. So if Rabbit Dog had used a lethal poison, then these 4 Shadow Beasts actually could have defeated Uvogin on their own. In the manga, they actually show that Worm survived the Big Bang impact. To be completely fair, we don't know how much longer Worm survived after this panel, but it is pretty crazy that we see him after being hit by the Big Bang impact and he's still talking. Also, the fact that Rabbit Dog and Porcupine were both capable of damaging Uvogin is also very impressive. A highball interpretation of this scene is that Rabbit Dog and Porcupine are so powerful that they can actually bypass the full power Nen defense from Uvogin. This is a highball interpretation because Uvogin is known to hold back in his fights. Even against Kurapika, when he was angry, he still starts the fight at 20% of his power. So you could argue that he's also fighting the Shadow Beast at 20%, but we really don't know. He doesn't give a specific number in this fight, the same way that he does against Kurapika. When he uses Big Bang Impact, the Phantom Troop members on the sidelines say that Uvo means business. So you could argue that maybe he began using a higher percentage of his power here. Furthermore, Porcupine actually reacts to a punch from Uvogin and activates his Hatsu ability before the punch lands, which is another underrated feat from Porcupine. Also, Worm's ability to counterattack Uvogin after being punched in the face and not immediately dying from it is an underrated feat for Worm as well. It was only 4 out of the 10 Shadow Beasts fighting Uvogin during this scene, and they were clowning around throughout the battle. But if you include the other 6 Shadow Beasts into this fight, then there's real arguments that even with these 4 goofing around like they did in this battle, the remaining 6 Shadow Beasts have real arguments that they would have just beaten Uvogin after this. At the end of the fight, Uvogin was poisoned, and Leech had poured parasites into Uvogin's body. So if Uvogin was just left alone, he was going to die anyway. Now the remaining Shadow Beasts are where the differences between the anime and manga change the power level of these characters considerably. In the anime, the remaining Shadow Beasts honestly seem pretty weak. Phaeton says he will fight 3 of them by himself, and Shizuku can defeat the other 2, and they're doing this while keeping Owl alive. And the anime cuts back to see that the Phantom Troop had low-diffed the Shadow Beasts, beat them almost instantly, and the Phantom Troop took 0 damage. It seems as though Phaeton beat 3 of them without using his Hatsu ability, and Owl gets off-screened by Machi. It makes them look very weak, but the manga depiction of this scene is a bit different. One of the Shadow Beasts says that Phaeton, Shalnark, Shizuku, and Machi look weak. The highest highball interpretation would be that the Shadow Beast is looking at their aura capacity, and he thinks that their aura capacity is weak compared to his own. As we see, different hunters throughout the story are able to get a general idea of the aura capacity of their opponents. A more lowball interpretation would just be that the Shadow Beast is being arrogant. To be fair, if Porcupine is able to actually damage an enhancer like Uvogin, the concept of the Shadow Beast having a large aura capacity is worth consideration. Furthermore, the line of dialogue where Phaeton says he will fight 3 of the Shadow Beasts while Shizuku fights the other 2, That's not present in the Viz manga translation. In the manga, they simply say that the Phantom Troop's going to fight the Shadow Beasts, and then the fight happens off screen. Then when we see the Phantom Troop again, rescuing Uvogin, Phaeton is not with them. This leads to a list of different interpretations for the difficulty of the Shadow Beast fight in the manga. Here are some lower interpretations. You could argue that the Phantom Troop had 1v1 battles, but everybody won their fights pretty easily, and Phaeton stayed behind to get information out of the remaining Shadow Beast. The lowest lowball interpretation, you could argue that in the manga, Phaeton fought all of them, and the rest of the Phantom Troop just left him behind to fight the Shadow Beast. The highest highball interpretation would be that the Phantom Troop each had 1v1 battles with the members of the Shadow Beasts, and Phaeton's opponent was so powerful that their fight was still ongoing. That's the highest highball interpretation of this scene, because Phaeton is not there after the Shadow Beast battle. You could also argue that maybe Phaeton's opponent was so powerful that he had to use his Hatsu ability, which is why the rest of the Phantom Troop left, while Phaeton fights the last remaining member of the Shadow Beasts. Those are highball interpretations. These are all different interpretations for the manga version of the fight only, because in the manga, the fight is off-screened. Another thing worth mentioning is immediately after the battle with the Shadow Beasts, the Phantom Troop appear as though they have no injuries, so you could argue that they beat them without taking damage. But a counter-argument is that even if they didn't take visible damage, that doesn't automatically mean that the fight was a low diff. When Zeno and Silva fought Crollo, at the end of that fight, Silva took almost zero notable visible damage, but it was actually a challenging fight for Silva. So in Hunter x Hunter, you actually can still have challenging fights without taking large portions of damage. All that being said, are the Shadow Beasts frauds? In the manga, they're not. They're powerful Nen users. They just happen to be in the story for a very short time, and basically just hyped up how powerful the Phantom Troop are. But in the anime, I'll just be honest, yeah, a lot of them are frauds. In the anime, a lot of them are. But in the manga, they're not. In the manga, they have real arguments for actually being pretty powerful. Now, all that being said, how would these Shadow Beasts do against Hisoka? So first off, it should be noted that Hisoka is actually getting stronger as the series progresses. This is shown to us in the data books because Hisoka in Greed Island has higher stats than he has in the beginning of the series, showing us that Hisoka is improving and getting stronger as the series goes on, which is either due to him growing from battle experience or maybe just pure talent. Therefore, the strongest version of normal Hisoka would be the Hisoka that fights Crollo, and a bit later in the video, we can talk about the post-mortem Nen Hisoka. So this Hisoka who fought Crollo, in a 1v1 fight, if Hisoka were to fight them gauntlet style, if we're using the anime version of the Shadow Beast, they don't really stand much of a chance. Shizuku beating 2 of them, Phaeton beating 3 of them without even using his Hatsu ability is a really bad anti-feat for the anime version of the Shadow Beasts. And then you have Machi, low diff off-screening one of them. It's pretty bad. It would be pretty bad. The Shadow Beast would not stand much of a chance. But using the manga interpretation of the Shadow Beast, things become a bit more complex. If Hisoka were to fight the manga version of the Shadow Beast, gauntlet style one after the other, then it's almost guaranteed that Hisoka's going to win. Individually, none of them have really displayed any feats that would put them above the Hisoka tier of power. However, if they were to battle Hisoka as a group of 10, then there's arguments that they have some possible win conditions against Hisoka. Hisoka is a character that holds back in a lot of his fights. In Heaven's Arena, it's stated a few different times that Hisoka was holding back. Also, against Goto, at the end of the fight, Hisoka reveals that he had attached bungee gum to the trees at the very beginning of the battle, meaning from the start of the fight, Hisoka could have simply blitzed Goto and ended the battle instantly, but he instead chose to make fun of Goto and see Goto's ability first. He genuinely had no reason to do that. He gave Goto numerous advantages, told him what his ability was, stood there and let Goto attack him, all basically to just make fun of him. So essentially, Hisoka has a habit of holding back in his fights. So if Hisoka's fighting all 10 of the Shadow Beasts and holding back, then the manga version of the Shadow Beast actually have a possible win condition. If Rabid Dog can land an attack on Hisoka and stun lock him with the poison, then the remaining Shadow Beasts actually have a chance at killing him. However, without Rabid Dog, from what the Shadow Beasts have displayed, they really don't stand much of a chance against Hisoka. If Hisoka's going all out from the very beginning, then the Shadow Beasts are lacking in feats that would confidently put them above a character like Hisoka. The best argument they have is 10 of them working together had a real chance at defeating the Uvagen we saw in York New City, but the counter to that is that Uvagen himself also holds back in his fights, and we don't know what percentage of his power Uvagen was using when he battled them. For example, if you argue that they only fought a 20% Uvagen, then you could say that a full power Uvagen would have defeated them all without much difficulty. Even though their aura output feats were impressive in terms of their offense with their Hatsu abilities, their aura defense is a bit questionable. Uvagen killed Porcupine by biting through him. He killed Rabbit Dog by shooting him with a piece of Porcupine's skull. It brings up the possibility that Porcupine and Rabbit Dog, their aura output is really high in their Hatsu abilities, but it's not as high in their base aura defense. We've seen other examples of this in the series where a character's Hatsu ability can scale above their base stats. One of the best examples being Gon, where his rock can scale to being 10 to dozens of times stronger than his normal punches. So maybe a similar concept applies to the Shadow Beasts, where their Hatsu ability scales above their raw aura defense, which would explain how they're actually able to damage Uvagen while still being one-tapped by casual attacks from Uvagen. Honestly, the way Rabbit Dog was one-shot, I don't even know if Uvagen enhanced the skull fragment with aura. He might have just shot him with like a normal bow. He might have just one-shot him with raw physical strength. The reality is, the 10 Shadow Beasts having an argument for being able to take down Uvagen while Uvagen might be holding back isn't a strong enough argument to put him above someone like Hisoka, who's relative to Crollo, a character who scales above Uvagen anyway. But using more low to medium ball interpretations, it becomes more likely that a full power Hisoka would win, even fighting all of them at the same time. Then if you want to talk about post-mortem Nen Hisoka, he would likely just slap them all around. That scene where Hisoka's fighting Crollo and he like grabs 5 puppets at once and turns them into a weapon and slaps them into the other puppets. That might be what post-mortem Nen Hisoka does to the Shadow Beast. But yeah, that's everything I wanted to say. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate the views in the comments. Like and subscribe, and I'll see ya on the next one.